Future Warrior, Dawn of the Deimos. Chapter 6. The dozen figures entered the room and took their seats around the rough-hewn stone table. A small dim light at its center, the only illumination. Each appeared identical, concealed beneath red robes, their faces masked in shadow. One stepped forward, a voice echoing in the darkness. "I call this council to session. We have grave matters to discuss. The words on the sands have revealed the truth we have all known and waited for. They return. The time of change is upon us." There was a chorus of assent, the words received with hushed prayers and softly spoken words of devotion. Only one remained silent. Atlas Heerden, the only son of General Jacob de Veers, a hunted traitor and mass murderer, smiled behind the shadow that veiled him. He almost laughed at the melodramatic display of shadows and masked words. He already knew the identity of almost every one of the other men and women in the room. He had forgotten more than the arrogant fools around him, pawns one and all. Now that the plan had achieved its aims, we must decide how best to approach the Divine Ones, how to renew our fealty so that we might survive the cleansing fire that is coming, and in so doing realize our destiny to rebuild a new civilization free of the taints of the past. A new voice spoke up from the shadows. "We must prove our commitment. We must strike at the foe before the eyes of the cleansers, so that they might see our faith." Atlas laughed, no longer able to contain his mirth. "Who gave you permission to speak, disbeliever? How dare you interrupt me? Oh, please do continue. I wait with bated breath to hear how you will personally lead an assault against highly alerted and well-prepared enemy positions, and with your death prove your use and wisdom." Atlas paused, waiting, but nothing but silence filled the room. "Well, while you plan your moment of glory, I might as well make a suggestion. If we want to prove a value to the Deimos, we need to come to them with something of real use, information. We can provide them with information on defenses, UEDF tactics, troop deployments, signal jamming codes, things that will make their victory easier." "And how will you approach them?" Atlas turned, marking the new voice, one of the few whose identity he did not know. "I studied their language while working for the other side. Xenolinguistics was a specialty of mine. I think I will be able to contact them easily enough. Convincing them that the message is genuine and not a trap will be more delicate, of course, but I think it can be done." Atlas waited patiently for a response, hushed whispers coming from the figures opposite. Atlas was not impressed by the fervor of Red Legion, but they needed him, and the relationship suited both sides. He had no doubt, however, that they would turn on him as soon as his usefulness was exhausted. "Very well, you may proceed, but do not fail us. We will be watching." Atlas smiled in the darkness. There was a screech, and the swift foot slid slightly as it landed on the ice-encrusted plascrete landing pad. Even before it had stopped moving, the side and rear ramps descended, and the interior was suddenly flooded with the sound of roaring wind and swirling icy particles. At the rear ramp, Stalker was the first one to touch the deck, slipping on the inch-thick ice layer as he did. Stalker cursed aloud at his foolishness as he found himself seated unceremoniously on the ice. He felt a hand appear on his shoulder and managed to keep his footing. Stalker looked across to see Link not saying a word as he released the steadying hand. Stalker swore he could almost see his friend's grin, though his EEA helmet's dark skull exterior. Stalker moved quickly forward until he was well clear of the transport and went down on one knee, taking care with his footing, and scanned the surrounding area for threats. He had no reason to expect any enemy presence, but the training died hard. In a close arc around him, the CCU formed up, mirroring Stalker's movements. The landing pad was lit by a bright floodlight, although the light seemed to be carried away by the roaring wind and swirling ice. As his EEA helmet's visual system adjusted slightly, removing any glare from the bright light, Stalker could see a cluster of buildings built into a sheer wall of ice close by. The buildings were interlinked by a network of tunnels, which were buried under drifts of snow, only the telltale bulges revealing their position. On the very edge of the landing pad was a large reinforced building which Stalker guessed held a shuttle or possibly equipment for the mining operation. It was also linked to the other structures by an ice-covered tunnel. In the far distance across the frozen, windswept landscape rose a much larger structure, from which were visible several lights. Stalker guessed that the structure was the settlement's water mine, the facility pumping still liquid water up from deep holes bored in the frozen sea and purifying it for transport onto automated cargo vessels. Stalker took one more look around at the barren, icy landscape with its deep snow drifts and was glad for his temperature-controlled EEA. Link, I want a 360 perimeter up at 100 around the transport. You see anything, report to me ASAP go. Link moved off and began issuing orders to the units. Stalker moved towards the large building close by the pad with the rest of the CCU. As he walked to the door, Stalker wondered what sort of reaction they were going to receive from the people at the settlement. Due to requirements of both secrecy and security, the system settlements had not been informed that they were going to be evacuated, and Stalker knew how imposing the Terra Nova looked. Whoever he ran into first was in for a big surprise. As he reached the building and went to the smaller door to the left of the main hangar, something caught Stalker's eye, and he looked up in surprise. Written on the hangar door in faded writing were the words, Axiom Corporation. Haven't seen that name in a while, Stalker thought as he pressed the door's access control, the doors panel coming up red and prompting an access code. Stalker frowned. I hate passwords. Flashdance, see what you could do with this. Flashdance was the call sign for Jean, the company electronics technician, or CET. There were 8 people in the CCU, including Stalker as acting CO. The other 7 were Link as the 2IC, second in charge, the company forward observer who called in and controlled artillery and airstrikes, CFO, the company communications operator, CCO, the company intelligence officer, CIO, the company surgical officer, CSO, the company ordnance technician, COT, and finally Jean as the CET. Jean stepped up and took a look at the door's access controls and quickly opened a maintenance panel next to the display on the door and plugged in a small device. Moments later, the door's display turned green, and with a slight crunching of ice, Jean forced the door open. Stalker noted the door opened inwards, probably to minimize interference from any ice buildup. We're in. Thanks, Jean. All right, let's go. And be careful, we're looking for citizens here. Link, we're in. Wait out. Stalker stepped into the dim space, which was immediately enhanced by his EEA helmet's light intensification systems. There was an emergency shuttle in the hangar, an old short-range type, Stalker noted, probably to take an injured worker to the orbital facility in a pinch. The rest of the hangar was filled with crates and assorted equipment that Stalker didn't recognize. Stalker ignored the silent, dark hangar and set off down the tunnel that led to the next building. After a short distance, he reached another door and was pleased to find that it wasn't locked. Stalker opened it and stepped inside into a corridor lit by a few small ceiling lights. A sign, an arrow on the wall said control room. Stalker followed the direction indicated by the arrow, his men behind him, instinctively moving quietly in tactical close combat formation. They reached the control room door without encountering anyone or any signs of life. The facility deathly quiet. Stalker gently opened the door and rifle first peered inside, light pouring out from the door. Across a wall were several rows of brightly lit monitors. Some were showing graphs and display readouts, while others showed live footage of parts of the facility, and Stalker could see people coming and going. In the center of the room was a large, comfortable chair, which has its back to the door. Stalker's advanced acoustic sensors picked up the muffled sound of music. Taking a step forward, Stalker peered over the top of the chair. In the seat was a scruffy-looking man in his late teens or early 20s. His eyes were closed, and he was wearing earphones that were pumping out a regular beat. Stalker reached down and shook the man's shoulder. The young man stirred and lazily looked up. The seemingly slow passage of time sped up in the blink of an eye as the young man's eyes widened, and he flew off the seat in shock, sending items scattering across the confined space of the small control room. Who the F? What the foo? Who the hell are you? I'm the commander of the 21st Terra Nova. We have a situation. I need to see the site manager or supervisor right now. The man stumbled for words, clearly still not comprehending. Terra Nova, who are you? We have precious little time. I need to see the senior person on site right now. That's Dr. Stiles. He's in G section. Family quarters, sleeping. Do you know what time it is? Actually, I have no idea what time it is, and I don't care. Go get him, please. The confused young man nodded quickly, looking at Stalker's dangerous-looking SBR. Yes, sir, I'll go get him. Hurry, please. The young man slipped past Stalker, and his eyes widened even more as he saw the passageway filled with black armored soldiers, and he hurried off out of sight deeper into the facility. Stalker watched him go with detached interest, wondering if he had ever been that young. The youthful control room operator reappeared several minutes later with an older man. Stalker guessed his age at late 50s. He showed obvious signs of having gotten hastily dressed and sported a large red full-face beard. Despite his clear surprise and dishevelment, the man clearly wanted to maintain his dignity and extended his hand to Stalker, who took it. I'm Dr. Joseph Stiles, site engineer, Alteris 16 facility. What can I do for you? He peered closer at Stalker's insignia. Battle Commander. Dr. Stiles, we have a situation. My company have been dispatched here to evacuate all your people immediately. To Stalker's surprise, the man didn't look shocked or protest the news, and instead just nodded. Understood, Commander. What can I do to help? We have a transport on the deck. How many are you? Dr. Stiles paused, and though for a moment, we have 78 staff plus their families, say around 200. All right, I need you to get everyone together and ready to move as soon as possible. They can bring only what they can carry, and Doctor, time is of the essence. Without hesitation, the doctor stepped into the control room and pulled an old-fashioned manual key from a drawer and put it into a slot in one of the control panels and turned it. Immediately, there was a flurry of red and amber lights come up on the panel, and the high-pitched screaming of a warning siren shattered the relative silence. I've activated the emergency incident alarm. The procedure requires that all personnel and their families muster at a designated point in the main mess hall for a head count. I'll show you the way, Commander. Stalker followed the two men into a large dining area with rows of stainless steel benches, chairs, and an industrial-sized kitchen. It didn't take long before people began to arrive in dribs and drabs, coming in either half-asleep dressed in sleeping attire or in bright yellow enviro suits, laughing and joking. The chatter and weariness both ended rapidly when the arriving people saw the group of heavily armed soldiers standing in the center of the room next to Dr. Stiles. Stalker watched them come impassively, waiting for everyone to arrive while being watched by a growing number of concerned faces. As the crowd grew, Stalker saw children of varying ages, their small faces showing excitement, not the concern over his presence that he saw on the faces of the adults. It took far longer than Stalker would have liked, but eventually Dr. Stiles informed him that everyone had arrived. Very well. Thank you, Doctor. Stalker took a step forward, and the little ongoing chatter dropped away. All right, everyone, listen up. This facility is being evacuated immediately. You have 15 minutes to gather your things. Bring only what you can carry and assemble at the main landing pad where a transport is waiting. Any questions? One man spoke up. This is all kind of sudden. What's this all about? It is for your own safety and a matter of planetary security. That's all I can tell you. Now I need everyone to get ready to leave. Some of the people looked unsure, and for a moment no one moved. All right, everyone, gather your things and move to the pad, quickly now. At the doctor's words, the people began to disperse in various directions, and muffled chatter once again broke out. Stalker turned to Dr. Stiles. Thanks for that. Now you two had better grab your gear. I'll see you all at the pad. Stalker walked back out into the blowing, icy wind. In the distance through the billowing snow, he could see the forms of his men deployed in textbook style around the transport and further out on the ice. Link, hold the perimeter. Evac commencing. All receive boss. Nothing here but ice out. Dazzle, contact the fleet and tell them that the evac will proceed in approximately 15 minutes. We will send the civvies up first, then do a final sweep of the facility before extraction. After a moment's delay, the CCO replied, I'm having trouble getting through, Commander. Lots of interference. I don't know if they're receiving me. Beneath his skull relief, EEA, helmet Stalker's face formed a scowl. Keep trying. There must be some atmospheric interference. The transport will have a clearer signal once it's out of the atmosphere. The loading of the swift foot began as soon as the people began emerging. No one, it seemed, was anxious to be outside in the freezing temperatures, and they headed straight for the transport without having to be told twice. Stalker and the CSO keeping count on the people as they hurried past. Dr. Stiles was one of the first to emerge, and he paused by Stalker, seemingly oblivious to the blasting wind. Dr. Stiles, was this an Axiom facility? Stalker pointed to the faded writing on the hangar. Used to be before my time. It's administered by THC, the Transplanetary Investment Corporation these days. They bought out most of Axiom's projects after it was dissolved following the moon conflict. Stalker didn't speak, he just looked up at the name. That was a nasty little war. Stalker turned to him. You were the military? Used to be. Was in the UE Engineering Corps for 10 years. Spent some time on the moon rebuilding infrastructure after the fighting ended. As I said, a nasty war. Stalker nodded sagely. Yes, it was. They all are. As the last person passed, the CSO signaled the OK with a thumbs up. All right, Doctor, that's everyone. You had better get aboard. The doctor shook Stalker's hand. Thank you, Commander. It's a good job you do. Stay safe. Stalker watched him go. The doctor had seemed very decent, and he'd been the only one who hadn't seemed to question the evacuation orders. Stalker guessed it must have been the soldier in him. Right on time, the swift foot lifted off, adding even more wind and flying ice to the continuing gale. Stalker watched it climb higher and begin its turn to line up its atmospheric escape vector. Without warning, there was a sudden blur of blindingly fast movement, and the swift foot exploded, the blast tearing the large craft in two, and for a brief moment the icy landscape was lit up like daylight. Stalker didn't have time to speak or think. He managed about half a dozen strides before the first debris began to rain down around him, and he dived and slid awkwardly across the icy surface. Stalker had just turned on his back to look up when he saw a sleek delta-shaped craft blast overhead and then soar skyward in a controlled roll, a victory roll. All units report. Stalker picked himself up as the units checked in. There were a few minor injuries and a couple of broken bones from the falling debris, but nothing serious. God damn it. Dazzle, do you have any contact with the CO yet? The CCO shook his head, still no joy. Stalker activated his TACnet and tried himself. Sunray 2, this is Alpha 2-1. We have been engaged by hostile forces. Sierra Whiskey is down. Confirm, over. There was only static over the TACnet. Sunray 2, this is Alpha 2-1. I have no copy. Switch to alternate and squawk, over. Once again, only static answered. Shit. Link materialized next to Stalker. We've swept the wreckage. No survivors, boss. Stalker looked around at the smoldering pieces of wreckage scattered across the landing pad. Here, and there were body parts and twisted charred corpses that moments before had been people, the people he had come to save. Stalker reviewed the grisly scene for a moment, viewing the carnage with a cold dispassion that surprised even himself, and he wondered how he had become so used to death. All right, Link send Bravo and Charlie to sweep the facility, deploy the rest of the company for all-round defense. Dazzle, keep trying to reach the fleet. I must know what's going on. Doc, patch the wounded up as best you can. Let's get it done, people. Despite the sudden change in fortunes and seeing all the people they had come to save, Stalker was impressed with his men as they adapted to the situation and displayed the professionalism and stoicism he had come to expect. They reacted to the new orders and new unknown enemy without question, moving swiftly and smoothly to defensive positions around the facility, digging shallow foxholes in the soft surface ice and snow. Stalker walked past the CCO and heard him cursing loudly. Stalker didn't even bother asking him if he had reached the fleet. The answer was obvious. Jamming was still blocking all communications. Stalker knew he was rapidly growing frustrated, and he paused for a moment and took a deep breath. He hated being out of contact and not knowing what was happening to the rest of the division and the fleet in space. He was racking his brain for a solution when a noise was suddenly amplified by his helmet's acoustic sensors. Stalker glanced up just in time to see a flight of large aircraft pass overhead. They about the size of a swiftfoot, but were unlike anything he had seen. They were roughly triangular, and their sides were covered in lumps and bulges, which almost gave them a living appearance, like the bumpy skin of some semi-aquatic animal. To Stalker, they looked wholly unhuman. As he watched them, they began to descend towards the far side of the water mine. Company stand 2, enemy to the east, link it over here, on the way, boss. All units, I want 1 section and 2 to the east perimeter. Form on my location. Everyone else hold fast. The first of the ships had just descended behind the facility and out of sight when Link and the others began to arrive and take up positions around Stalker. Stalker more sensed than saw Link and the rest of the CCU arrive and wait next to him for orders as he looked over the terrain with a skilled and critical eye. There was no time to reach the ice mining facility. The terrain between the mine and the settlement was the broken surface of the frozen ocean and would afford any enemy reasonable cover. Stalker guessed the enemy would make for the settlement rather than the pad and hangars and quickly formulated a basic defense plan in his mind. Stalker had about 2/3 of his company at his disposal, the rest being deployed, covering the rear arc. Link take half of the men and place them around the main settlement and set up a blocking position. I will place the rest along here and provide enfilading fire to your front. Link sent a flurry of hand signals to the men around him, and without a word, he headed off towards the ice-covered buildings with his loping jog, which Stalker knew so well from their endless runs together over the past few years. Stalker's plan was simple and consisted of a basic L-shaped ambush. If the enemy advanced on the settlement, they would be caught by fire from 2 directions, which would form an interlocking kill zone. The wall of ice the settlement was built into would protect the right flank, giving the enemy the choice of either retreating, trying to flank around to the extreme left, or fighting their way through teeth of the trap. Stalker grinned wolfishly. He had yet to see any enemy do that in the face of a defending Terra Nova company. It took Stalker's veterans only moments to realize their CO's plan, and they deployed smoothly to carry it out, hurriedly finding positions in the world of swirling snow and broken ice that give them good cover and firing arcs. Stalker found himself a spot by a crack in the ice near the landing pad. The ruptured ice created a slight overhang, which Stalker slid in behind and peered rifle first through, his prone dark figure quickly becoming white in the swirling snow. Stalker heard the sound of an aircraft, and he froze as a sleek Delta-shaped craft blasted overhead, disappearing out of sight. Silently, Stalker cursed that he had deployed to the surface without the company's cat's eye manpads. Stalker's grip on his ASBR tightened as he began to pick out movement around the facility. It was still too distant to make out any detail, but amongst the ice dark shapes were moving. Stalker saw that the dark figures appeared to be moving in coordinated rushes from cover to cover in the direction of the settlement. As they drew closer, Stalker found that he was holding his breath. Stalker watched them close, seemingly right up to the ice-strewn buildings, and was just about to contact Link when his voice crackled over the comm net. Targets to my front, engaging. The icy landscape erupted with blue impulse fire from dozens of points, the lethal blue rounds lancing out towards the leading figures and cutting them down. The fire was murderous, but around Stalker his men held their fire. Stalker began to see flashes of green return fire impacting around the buildings. Still he and his men held their fire. The firefight had lasted about 2 minutes when Stalker saw the first of the enemy begin to move towards his position, trying to flank the stubborn resistance. With his enhanced vision, Stalker finally got his first good look at this new enemy. They were almost alarmingly tall, but had slender bodies and wore close-fitting body armor. They carried short, stubby-looking weapons which had no hard angles, instead being smooth and curved. They carried their weapons with hands that ended in long, slender fingers tipped long claws, which surprisingly didn't seem to be a hindrance due to the energy weapons having open trigger guards. Most wore full-face helmets that hid their features, but a few had their heads exposed, revealing their faces. Their heads were elongated and ended in a broad mouth that seemed to constantly grin, revealing rows of shark-like teeth. The most alarming and alien thing, however, was how they moved. They moved slightly faster than any human naturally did. The effect was like watching visual footage that had been slightly sped up. To Stalker, they were more alien than anything he could possibly have imagined. As Stalker waited patiently, groups of the lanky aliens moved around the jagged ice towards his line. He could feel the tension growing in the men around him, even though he could not see them. To their credit, they held fire and waited for the command. Stalker sighted on the nearest of the Deimos and slowly and deliberately breathed the order, "Fire." Stalker saw the head of his target snap back, a splash of dark fluid remaining on the white snow as the slender body fell. Once the firing began, Stalker's training cut in, and he engaged targets smoothly and professionally as he would have done on a target range. It was only as he paused to reload that he briefly took in the deadly space he had created. A whirlwind of brilliant bolts of blue crisscrossed from two directions, creating an environment that seemingly nothing could survive in, and yet the fire was being returned with gusto by the Deimos. The green flashes of their energy weapon fire, mixing with the blue to create an almost surreal scene. In the face of the ferocity of the Terra Nova men's fire, the Deimos didn't retreat. Despite their losses, they seemed to revel in the intensity of the battle, and the icy landscape seemed to seethe and bubble with their numbers. There was bright flash and sudden hiss, and Stalker saw a chunk of ice next to his head disappear. Stalker rolled clear and pumped out a 50mm frag grenade from his underbarrel M503, which went off with a crump behind a nearby snow drift, eliciting a guttural roar in response. Stalker dropped an empty magazine to the ground and slammed another home. "Link, how's your situation?" Link's voice coming straight back over the commnet. "No breaches in the line. I have 2 Kia, say again 2 or Delta. We're holding, but we can't stay here forever." Stalker could hear the tension in his 2IC's voice. "Roger that Link, wait out." Stalker spoke into the comm as he engaged anything that popped up in his sight range with rifle fire. "Sunray 2, this is Alpha 2-1. We have engaged hostile forces. We require evac over." Stalker fired a long burst. His target dropped out of sight, but Stalker knew he had missed. "This is Alpha 2-1 to any 3rd Fleet vessel. We are being engaged by strong enemy forces. We require extraction over." Stalker was about to give up when he heard a garbled, halting, illegible response. "Say again your last." "Alpha 2-1, this is Arrow. Transport is en route your location. 5 minutes over. All received. Be advised. Arrow danger close. Hostile enemy airs in the AO. Over. Received and understood 2-1. Arrow out." Stalker breathed an inner sigh of relief and was just about to signal everyone to prepare for pickup when there was the sudden roar of a heavy weapon. A long burst of bright energy fire sprayed the settlement's buildings, throwing up chunks of ice. Stalker risked rising a little bit higher, just in time to see a second burst fired from the distant heavy weapon near the refinery. "Shit. All units fall back to the pad and prepare for extraction. Link, get your people out of there." Stalker saw something small and black come hurtling through the air and land close by. Reflexively, he rolled away from it. The explosion and shockwave slammed him into the ground, and he had to fight hard to keep himself conscious as he threatened to black out. Stalker had just recovered his senses when there was a roar from nearby, and a group of Deimos charged the line. To Stalker's still dazed mind, they seemed like demons. The speed they moved was frightening, and Stalker sprayed the onrushing Deimos on full automatic, emptying the ASBR's magazine in moments, the burst tearing through the aliens' armor and ripping their slim bodies to pieces. Stalker shook his head to clear it, just as he picked up a new sound. 2 F-55s roared overhead, and explosions rippled across the ice and refinery, adding to the chaos, the enemy heavy weapon falling silent. As they disappeared from view, 2 Swiftfoot transports came down at breakneck speed, fire pouring from their automated 15mm heavy machine guns. 2-1, this is Starling Leader, we're on the deck, ready for extraction. "Roger that, Starling. It's damn good to see you. 21st Terra Nova, we are leaving. Exfil now." Stalker headed for the transports, seeing others do the same, some dragging wounded and dead comrades with them. Stalker reached the nearest Swiftfoot and paused by the open side ramp, turning to cover his men. As the Terra Nova withdrew, the Deimos redoubled their efforts, seemingly infuriated that their prey was escaping, coming on with reckless abandon. A round of their green energy fire struck Stalker on his shoulder, the impact throwing off his aim. Stalker glanced at his suit readout, which didn't register any breach, and kept on firing. Others formed around Stalker and the other ramps, the ground at their feet rapidly becoming filled with empty ASBR magazines, green Deimos energy fire pummeling the transports, leaving dark scorch marks on their fuselages. All units, numbers check. Stalker listened as one after another all of the unit commanders confirmed that their men all were on board and accounted for. Stalker tapped the shoulder of the man next to him, and the men around him one by one withdrew up into the ramp. Stalker emptied the last of his mag and hurried up the ramp after them. "We're all aboard, Starling, go." Stalker hit the ramp close button, taking one last look at the scene as the transport lifted off. Part of the settlement had caught fire. The smoke swirling in the wind and bursts of green energy fire were chasing the swift foot as it climbed. Stalker turned from a scene. He had work to do. He climbed the ladder to the cockpit and crouched behind the two pilots next to the navigator, listening to their conversation. "Watch your vector, Starling 2, preparing for orbital run. Keep it tight now at 32 degrees. Stalker watched in silence as the view through the cockpit began to grow dark as they entered space, the craft shuddering noticeably as they climbed on full power. "Watch that debris. Shit, was that the orbital station? Yeah, those bastards must have hit it while we were on the ground. Did Starling 3 get away?" The left pilot just shook his head, the gesture enough of an answer. As the swift foot turned away from the debris, Stalker saw where they were headed and almost wished he had opted to stay on the surface. The space around Alteris was filled with dozens of large dark ships which were being furiously engaged by the heavily outnumbered gray warships of the Third Fleet. The space around the large ships was filled with hundreds of smaller fighters, the whole scene saturated with countless missiles, long bursts of tracers, and energy weapon and cannon fire of every type. Stalker saw the massive bulk of the Osprey flanked by a pair of larger ships in the extreme distance. And as he watched, he saw that she was moving, but in the opposite direction, away from the battle. "What's going on? Where's the Osprey going?" The pilots were jolted by Stalker's voice, clearly not having been aware of his presence behind them. "We're leaving, Commander. The fleet is pulling back. They hit us shortly after you landed, came out of nowhere. We were trying to hold on long enough to get all the surface teams and civilians aboard before we go, but they're tearing the fleet to pieces. Inbound vectors. I got it. 3 bogies at point 185. Where the hell's our escort?" As if in response, Stalker saw a lone dark star blast past them and dive below and left, firing 2 missiles which streaked away out of sight, the dark star close on their heels. "Bogies have broken contact. Looks like they're going after the 55. Roger. Let's get the hell out of here. Keep it at full power. We will take the direct route." Stalker watched as the pilot headed towards a massive firefight at breakneck speed, angling slightly to the right, Stalker picking out the shape of the Artemis amongst the chaos. "Confirm IFF. I don't want to be shot down by our own ships." IFF confirmed. "We're on the grid." IFF, Stalker knew, was shorthand for identification friend or foe, an automated coded signal that identified the transports as friendly and meant that they wouldn't be engaged by the UEF warship's automated defenses. Stalker glanced behind him into the cargo hold. Most of the men were strapped to their seats around the edge of the hold, but a few were tending to those who were wounded, and in one corner Stalker counted 6 bodies laid together. Link and some of the others looked up at him, expressionless behind their EEA helmets. Stalker gave slight nod, which was returned by a few of the men. Considering they had just fought bloody alien, Stalker thought they were holding up well. Stalker turned back to see that they were entering the battle area. The UEF ships were in a staggered line and were withdrawing slowly as they fought a fighting withdrawal to cover the Osprey. Stalker also saw that at least 3 Third Fleet ships had been immobilized and were being pounded into wrecks by the dark ships that swarmed around them. "Defenses to auto. Here we go, hold on to your butts." The pair of swift foots dived in unison into the chaos. Stalker just watched, being able to do nothing but spectate as the lives of all aboard were placed entirely in the hands of the flight crew. Stalker felt like he was on a roller coaster ride as the pilot threw the large transport around like it was a fighter. There was so much flashing past so fast that Stalker found himself wondering how the pilots could keep track of everything. Two little Delta bastards just passed beneath us. I don't think they saw us. Watch that tracer fire. Shit, that was close. Watch that debris on the right. Make sure Arrow is ready to receive us. We will be coming in a hell of a hurry. Fighter on our tail. The pilot jinked hard left and right before throwing the transport into a roll and passing so close to a UEF frigate that Stalker thought he would have been able to barely slide a sheet of paper between them. Where's the bastard? I've lost him. I think the missiles close and defenses might have tagged him as we passed. Arrow, this is Starling Leader requesting the red carpet treatment. Roger, Starling. The carpet will be laid out for your arrival. As the transports approached the bulk of the Artemis at breakneck speed, Stalker saw the landing bay was still closed, but the pilot didn't back off the power. Stalker was convinced they were going to crash when at the last moment the doors shot open, the transports blasting through, before the door snapped closed again. Stalker was nearly thrown through the cockpit window as the pilot applied full reverse and lifted the nose before coming down heavily and sliding across the spacious bay with a metallic screech, the transport coming to a stop just feet from a bulkhead wall. The right-hand pilot hit the internal comm switch. This is your pilot speaking. Thank you for flying with Starling Airways. We trust you enjoyed your flight. Please exit through the rear and side exits and leave your seats and tray backs in the upright position.